Hi there. This is a bonus video, a theory video on what I think really happened behind the scenes at the Great Tourney of Harrenhal, which led to the events of Robert's Rebellion, sparking off all the events of the A Song of Ice and Fire novels and Game of Thrones. This came up because they just announced we're making another Game of Thrones prequel. Well, it's really a book prequel, a Broadway stage play about the Great Tourney at Harrenhal, and I made a whole other video on that, and I'm splitting this off from that. Because it's a bonus video and I want to get it done quickly on my end, it isn't going to have any slides, it's going to be an audio-only podcast, and I'm trying to record this in one sitting so I can just dash it off without listening through the whole thing over again to edit the audio. I know when people understand when I say, oh, I'm dashing it off, and then it turns out to be something an hour long. Well, I'm skipping the post-production steps of writing out slides and editing it eat up a lot of time, and I'm just recording it off the top of my head, not really scripting it, just with some notes here. I have some quotes and notes I want to read off, but I didn't put as much prep and post into this. I'm dashing it off because I want to have it out just as a special. It's bonus content. So, what do I think really happened at the Great Tourney of Harrenhal? My specific question is, who organized the tournament? Was it really a plot, and by who? Who organized this tournament, and what exactly were they hoping to gain from it? What was the plot going on? Because the book makes it pretty clear that someone was organizing it. There are hints it wasn't just a random tournament. When most people ask what really happened at Harrenhal, these are so obvious. Like, I hate when people go like, is Jon Snow really dead? That isn't a question. You're asking the specific mechanics of how he'll come back to life, which the TV show totally ignored. They just went, yep, he's alive again. We don't really need to go through any mechanics of it, which it's idiotic. But, obvious things like who's Jon Snow's mother, that there are at best 3 or 4 candidates in a giant novel series. And I understand if you're debating between 2 or 3 candidates, I get that. But people who go, well, I hope they'll set it up eventually 6 seasons into it. And look, by the end of book 1, people were telling, look, it's either Ashara Dane or Lyanna Stark. There's not going to be another person. Is it a double bluff he's pulling on us? We're not really sure. But I hate it when people ask obvious questions like that. So the stuff people usually think about is what really happened. Yes, Lyanna Stark was probably the mysterious Knight of the Laughing Tree. I don't even consider that a question. I take it as a fact that she was the Knight of the Laughing Tree. And yes, I take it as a fact that Rhaegar and Lyanna probably fell in love in private during the tournament. You could ask, well, what specifically happened to make them fall in love, but there was some legitimate question from people who even thought after book 1, oh, Jon is Rhaegar's son, like maybe he's a son through rape, or did Lyanna really fall in love with him? Well, I don't normally trust the TV show. In the broadest strokes that they presented as this love affair, I always personally felt it was a love affair, and that's what they ran with, so I don't think it would be a subversion of that or something. So yeah, she was the Knight of the Laughing Tree, and they probably fell in love in private. Though Rhaegar didn't abduct, quote-unquote, Lyanna until almost a full year later. And that's the point people keep forgetting, that the timing doesn't match up. Then in terms of the events surrounding it, my question isn't, did Rhaegar and Lyanna fall in love, but, why did he only run off with her a full year later? If they had fallen in love then, why did he run off with her when he did? What intrigues me more is the question of who organized the tournament and manipulated these events. And the bigger issue that, as I was thinking on this, it all touches upon, is I really do not agree with the, quote, Southron Ambitions theory, which was posted by respected fandom theorist Stephen Sass back in 2012, right after the 5th book came out. And the Southron Ambitions theory got so popular, it's pretty much treated as fact throughout most of the fandom for the books. But there are other stray mentions in the World of Ice and Fire which lead me to think otherwise. That, and when I actually sat down to read through the Southron Ambitions theory, it isn't really that much of a coherent theory one way or the other. That's what I take issue with, that, oh, the Southern Lords were intermarrying for alliances, and then what? And it doesn't really have a clear point to it. So because all of this ties together with leading up to the events of Robert's Rebellion, and this screwed up the marriage alliances, I'm talking about who secretly organized the tournament, and why I don't think Southron Ambitions really explains that in its entirety as an essay. I'll get through that. So if you cross-reference everything we learned about the tourney at Harrenhal from World of Ice and Fire, that this is a theory from 2012, World of Ice and Fire came out 2014, there's a few other mentions that are, if you look at it subtly, they hint at things. 3 big points that don't hold up. 1. Rhaegar didn't abduct Lyanna until almost a full year after the tournament, and in that time Rhaegar did nothing to turn against his father, even though the theory is the tournament was for Rhaegar to recruit people. 2. The World Book points out that Lord Whent must have had a secret benefactor because he couldn't afford such a big tournament, that it's impossible. And 3. It was Varys who urged the Mad King to go to the tournament. What I'm going to be arguing in this is I think Varys was the secret mastermind of the whole thing, not Southron Ambitions. Background, the objective facts. What we do know is that Lord Walter Whent, Lord of Harrenhal, organized the biggest tournament in living memory, possibly in the history of Westeros, to celebrate his daughter coming of age. Tournaments are usually for weddings or other events on that scale. Yes, it's a good way to audition potential husbands, but it's also established during the history of Westeros that tournaments are frequently used as recruitment drives for lords who are preparing for war. The central plot of the third Dunk and Egg prequel novella is an attempt to kickstart a second Blackfyre rebellion by using a tournament at a wedding. Or it's possible Lord Whent just wanted to show off his wealth. That does happen sometimes, but many suspected that Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince, was secretly using the tournament as a recruitment event to rally great lords to back him in removing his father, Aerys, the Mad King. The Mad King himself grew suspicious that Rhaegar was doing this, so he went to the tournament himself to keep an eye on his son and remind the lords and commoners what a great king he was. Which utterly backfired because Aerys' insanity had been getting worse over time. He hadn't actually been seen in public outside the Red Keep in years. 3 years since the kidnapping attempt of the Defiance at Duskendale, and they think that the stress of that exacerbated his insanity and sped up his downward spiral and made it a lot worse. That in the 3 years he wasn't in public, he just totally degenerated. So when he shows up at Harrenhal, everyone could see he looked like a crazy man, with inches-long fingernails and long, filthy, matted hair, because he was paranoid about having blades in his presence, and he was gaunt because he was afraid his food was being poisoned. And his appearance was one thing, his behavior was not that of a sane man. That he was visibly crazy. He'd switch from one moment to the next, crying to laughing to anger, then silent again. And just everyone was like, what the hell? This crazy, disheveled hobo of a man. And this only made the lords of Westeros rally against Aerys even more. Because up until then, they weren't sure just how insane he was, that he was getting worse. So the theory is, was the tournament a secret plot to recruit all the great lords of the realm against Aerys? And if so, by whom? We have a few key points of evidence. I listed these off. Point 1, Rhaegar didn't actually abduct Lyanna until almost a full year later. So if he had intended to use the tournament to make a move on his father, why didn't he do anything? mean, I've seen some fans say it's because his love affair with Lyanna derailed his plans, but Lyanna went back to Winterfell after the tournament. The actual timeline of events and how Rhaegar absconded with Lyanna is just very suspicious. He only absconded with her after his son with Elia Martell was born. That happened after the tournament. It was a difficult birth, and the maesters said another pregnancy would probably kill her. And this is months after the tourney, and what's crucial is that Rhaegar was motivated by this prophecy that said that the prince that was promised would be born to him, but also that the dragon has 3 heads. A lot of you are already familiar with this. The theory is that Rhaegar thought the prince that was promised is actually 3 people acting together, and he was convinced that these would be his 3 children. He already had a daughter and now a newborn son with Elia Martell, but they just said she can't have any more children. It would kill her and the child. That you can't have another child with her. So this motivated him to instead hook up with Lyanna Stark. After the son with Elia was born, months after the tourney in Harrenhal. So if he was going to move against his father, he was at least waiting until he had a 3rd infant. Not even, was he waiting for them to come to adulthood? I have no idea. But all that stuff the TV show threw together, by the way, about, oh, he got an annulment. This wouldn't last 10 minutes of scrutiny if they had said it in a real writer's room. That leads to mind-boggling that crap they write down in their bad scripts a year in advance is something people react to within 10 minutes of it airing and point out the plot holes in it. It's not as if we came to realizations about plot holes after a month of heavy thinking on an episode. It's like people watching it live were going, that doesn't make sense. Not just this, I mean, all sorts of other plot holes they had in later seasons. That you were doing this for months and you never noticed or you don't care. That the whole they got an annulment thing is they didn't care and were just cutting corners because they didn't want to spend more time explaining it. You can't get an annulment from a wife who already gave you 2 children. That's an effing divorce. What you were describing is divorce, and they don't have that in their society. The only legitimate thing you can do is get an annulment for a marriage that was never consummated, or if you're pushing it and can pull in a favor from the High Septon, maybe get an annulment from a marriage that is childless. On the grounds, I'm going to remarry, and maybe this woman is barren, maybe it's the combination of us, whatever. Occasionally you can get an annulment for a marriage that has produced no children. That you can't get an annulment if you have 2 children. As the books do it. So this is not what's really happened. The real story of the books, that's not what happened. Basically, it's suspected that Rhaegar thought he could just polygamously marry more than one wife. Consider that the Targaryens routinely practice brother-sister incest. That the first Targaryen king, Aegon the Conqueror, was simultaneously married to both of his sisters. He had 2 simultaneous queens who were also his sisters. And the thing is that after the conquest, they had the whole Faith Militant uprising. The Targaryens confirmed we're already blood of incest, we might as well keep doing it. So they established, well, Targaryens were the kings, we can keep doing that. They tacitly stopped having polygamous marriages, but they never formally said they couldn't. It's just this tacit agreement with the church that they were tactful enough not to have another prince take more than one wife. They weren't that stupid. But it was never a rule. It was more of a guideline than a rule with that. And there's hints of this description in the World Book that says, why did Daemon Blackfyre rebel against his brother Daeron the Good? For he wanted to marry his sister who had been married off to the Prince of Dorne instead. Why would he rebel over losing the woman he loved when he already had a wife and 7 sons? And it says, well, Daemon Blackfyre, the suspicion is he thought he could just have a polygamous marriage. That nothing is stopping us, we just haven't done it for 200 years. So there's this running theory that Rhaegar thought he could just simultaneously have more than one wife and produce legitimate children with them, as opposed to just keeping her as a mistress. That's the running theory anyway, and most people agree with all these points. This isn't theory yet. The peculiar part, though, is the specific mechanics of how Lyanna was abducted, not the part of that they waited until after Elia couldn't have a child, a third child. We have no idea what Elia thought of this. Would Elia have gone along with this? I mean, Dorne has paramours and stuff, so I don't know what she thought of this arrangement. But the specific way he ran off with her, not the timing, that was after his second child was born. They said you need a third child, but not by Elia. It was almost a year after the tournament at Harrenhal. The Starks had gone back to Winterfell. They were now returning to the Riverlands almost a year later, because Ned and Lyanna's older brother Brandon was going to marry Catelyn Tully. They'd been betrothed for a while, but there were plans for a grand wedding between these two great houses. So the Stark party, including all their retainers, was slowly making its way down the King's Road to the Riverlands. Brandon got there ahead of the slow-moving main wedding party, at which point young Peter Baelish challenged him to a duel over Catelyn, who was about to marry him. A duel in which Brandon nearly killed Baelish. That's when their duel happened that they mention. Meanwhile, as the slow-moving main wedding party with hundreds of retainers is coming down the King's Road through the neck, Brandon rode ahead and he was fighting Littlefinger in a duel at Riverrun. Meanwhile, Lyanna apparently rode off to Harrenhal again. For some unclear reason. She was abducted by Rhaegar near Harrenhal. And people conflate the two events in their mind because they both happened near Harrenhal, but no, it's she left and over a year later returned to Harrenhal seemingly alone. And no one ever remarks on that. Why did she go back to Harrenhal? They don't really explain it. Why wasn't she in Riverrun with Brandon? Because Harrenhal's close to Riverrun, but not that close. I mean, it's a couple of days or even weeks' journey from the west of the Riverlands to the east part, to the middle of the Riverlands. It's not just a day trip, and there's no real explanation of what happened. And he didn't just abduct her alone, he was there with his two Kingsguard, Arthur Dayne and Oswell Whent. So, what's going on with them? Whatever the case, the timing doesn't match up, is my point. That if Rhaegar's intent was to use the tournament to rally lords to instantly start a rebellion against his father, he didn't act on it. Then again, okay, well, maybe he was just sending out, diplomatic feelers, that this wasn't going to be the event that sparked off a rebellion, but he was laying the groundwork of letting everyone get to know him, because this is a society that doesn't have television. He needs to audition himself to all the great lords of the realm as, look how sane and knightly I am winning this joust, and honorable. Aren't I a great alternative to the increasingly insane king who is my father? That he could have been doing it. If it was his intent to recruit lords to his side, it wasn't for an instant rebellion, but a gradual accumulation of allies. Not that this contradicts anything with the other theories yet. Point two, and this is the crucial one when I was going through it, like I said, is there's this key hint in the World Book that wasn't really in any of the 5 novels before it, because the Southron Ambitions theory was made after the 5th book. World Book came out after the 5th book. There's this hint in a line in the World Book where it says, the prize money was so high that even a major lord like Walter Whent couldn't possibly have afforded it on its own. This is crucial. Like in Breaking Bad, when they're explaining to Walter, you can't go out and buy an expensive car. People know that as a teacher, you can't afford it. And if you do, they'll suspect you got illicit money from somewhere. That just, if you look at how much money they put out, anyone who knows anything about like the royal taxes and stuff would go, Harrenhal doesn't make that much money, and it's a big, wealthy tract of land, it's very lush and abundant, but even Harrenhal could not make a tournament of this size. You got funding from somewhere. So this was not just an innocent tournament for Lord Whent to show off his wealth. It was the largest tournament in living memory, possibly in history. He blatantly couldn't afford it. So it's not a question of if he had a secret backer, but who was that secret backer? Who gained from funding this giant tournament? Well, the World Book offers an obvious suggestion by saying that many suspected it was Rhaegar himself who secretly gave Lord Whent the funding. And the evidence they point to is that Walter Whent first started organizing the tournament soon after being visited by his brother, Sir Oswell. Oswell Whent, a knight of the Kingsguard, the same Kingsguard who later joined Arthur Dayne with helping Rhaegar when he picked up Lyanna. So the timing of he couldn't afford this, it happened right after his brother in the Kingsguard met him. The theory is that Oswell was a go-between for whoever really was planning it, who everyone assumes was Rhaegar. But again, why didn't Rhaegar do anything right after the tournament? But the whole, maybe it was winning allies that were used to, well, the second Blackfyre rebellion in the third Dunk and Egg novella was supposed to immediately launch into a rebellion. Maybe this is the more of the laying the groundwork, building allies kind of thing, and I'll get back to that repeatedly through this, of how fast did Rhaegar intend to do this. But okay, what was point one here? Point one, the timing doesn't match up. Point two, there was a secret backer, it's just a question of who. And point three, like I said, is exactly how did the Mad King come to attend it? That they don't say this in the first book, they just go, the Mad King got suspicious of him, so he went to the tournament. Wasn't until the third novel that it actually says it was Varys who specifically urged Aerys to intervene. That even some of his other sycophantic advisors told him, no, do not shut this down. That originally, Rhaegar wanted to shut down the tournament entirely, or even ban all tournaments in Westeros, and his own sycophant said, well, no, my lord, your grace, that'll turn even more people against us. That is such a blatantly bad idea. Even I, this spineless yes-man, am telling you, don't do that. It would be a disaster, because everyone loves tournaments, from the lords to the commoners. But it was Varys who said, I urge you, King Aerys, you must go to do what exactly? Keep an eye on his son, steal his thunder, overshadow him, just so he didn't try to start a rebellion while his father was physically present with his guards? Which, of course, led to massive public backlash when everyone saw how insane he was. Specifically, I'm sorry, it wasn't book 3, it was book 5, is the quote I'm going to give here from A Dance with Dragons, a Barristan Selmy chapter, The Kingbreaker. Not that it really matters, because Southron Ambitions was made after book 5. Book 5, Barristan chapter, quote, the memory was still bitter. Old Lord Whent had announced the tourney shortly after a visit from his brother, Sir Oswell Whent of the Kingsguard. With Varys whispering in his ear, King Aerys became convinced that his son was conspiring to depose him, that Whent's tourney was but a ploy to give Rhaegar a pretext for meeting with as many great lords as he could, that he had brought together. It was a pretext for meeting with as many great lords as could be brought together. Aerys had not set foot outside the Red Keep since Duskendale, yet suddenly he announced that he would accompany Prince Rhaegar to Harrenhal, and everything had gone awry from there. That hurt Aerys more than if he'd stayed in King's Landing. And everyone saw he lost his mind, which is so blatantly stupid. Let's have the crazy disheveled hobo guy with inch-long nails and crazy beard, and who's laughing and crying and acting like he's schizophrenic, because he is. All this leads to the question, was Varys genuinely that stupid? Or was he manipulating the Mad King towards his own downfall? That was Varys, who was allegedly on his father's side against Rhaegar, really acting in the Mad King's best interest when he said that? Probably not. Though even the Southron Ambitions theory doesn't think he was either, but I'll get to that. And also consider, even after this, for an alleged genius spy master, Varys had a surprisingly low impact on stopping Robert's rebellion. He had very little impact on stopping it. What did he do during the war? He couldn't find Robert when he was hiding out in Stony Sept or his troop movements or really assassinate anyone. The only significant action he took for the rest of the war was when Tywin came to the gates and Pycelle urged the Mad King, no, he's come as a friend, open the gates, and Varys said, no, he's going to kill us all, close the gates, and Mad King listened to Pycelle. But at that point, he was just saving his own skin. But I don't know, like, what did he gain by saying, no, keep Tywin out? Because that would make a long siege and prolong the war. Then again, maybe he wanted that. I'll get back to that. That I've been thinking it over. The central issue for this entire video, the entire question of what happened at Harrenhal after the 5th novel, hinges on that we don't, even now, we still don't entirely know Varys' ultimate goals and motivations. And I think there are 2 possibilities for Varys. Not that he was loyal to Aerys, that's obviously a ruse. The question is between 2 things. Either Varys was a secret Rhaegar supporter, or he was a secret Blackfyre supporter the entire time, which of course ties into other theories about Varys. In the 5th novel, it's introduced that Rhaegar's son with Elia Martell didn't actually die in the sack of King's Landing, but was secreted away to the Free Cities to grow up in exile under the alias Young Griff, but now styling himself as King Aegon VI. By the way, I do not think Jon Snow's real birth name that Lyanna gave him was Aegon. I think it's either Aemon or Jaehaerys, because these are people Rhaegar admired. We kind of forgot he already had a son named Aegon. And they just combined that because, oh, the TV fans wouldn't be familiar with it. Something as sacred as the secret name of the main character in the central R+L=J plot mystery, I think they were willing to cheat on, but time will tell on that. We have no true way of knowing. But Aegon VI, who I'll refer to for clarity as Young Griff after this, his alias, claims to be his second child, the baby who was in the sack of King's Landing, his son by Elia Martell. But many fans strongly suspect that this is a lie, and Young Griff is actually the last of the Blackfyres, who are Targaryens of a sort. They're a younger branch of the Targaryen family, a bastard branch, who led 5 rebellions against the Targaryens of the past century. Particularly many think this because Young Griff is supported by the Golden Company, who are a mercenary army founded by exiled Blackfyre supporters and their sons and grandsons. So, many readers think Young Griff is who Varys claims he is, the son of Rhaegar and Elia, in which case he would outrank Daenerys in line of succession. Because Daenerys is Rhaegar's younger sister, younger sibling regardless of gender, Young Griff would be ahead of her in line of succession. While quite a few other readers suspect he's really a Blackfyre. And this is all arbitrary, of course, because even if he is a Blackfyre, he's of Targaryen blood, just a younger branch, and what is power? I have an army, I have a dragon. What is legitimacy? The question is, which agenda was Varys supporting back during Robert's Rebellion in these 2 scenarios? All of which, in turn, runs up against the Southron Ambitions theory put forward by that essay by Stefan on Tower of the Hand. I'll link that below. Please cross-reference with his essay. It doesn't really hold up well to me because, to start out with, he points out that the great houses usually intermarry with their own vassals within their own region, not with other great houses. That Starks marry Glovers, Umbers, and Flints. They don't marry Tullys, usually. And now suddenly Rickard Stark started intermarrying his children with multiple other great houses and forging alliances with them. And the name Southron Ambitions is actually a direct quote. It comes from a phrase Lady Barbary Dustin uses when she's describing this in a long speech in the 5th novel. And she insists this was all a plot by the Maesters, that Rickard Stark's Maester gave him the idea to have Southron Ambitions to ally with southern kingdoms to do what exactly? Doesn't really specify. But Rickard had his eldest son Brandon betrothed to marry Catelyn Tully, his daughter Lyanna betrothed to marry Robert Baratheon, and his younger son Ned Stark was fostered at the Eyrie with Robert Baratheon, Lyanna's betrothed, under Jon Arryn. Because Rickard Stark, Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, Steffon Baratheon, the now deceased father of Robert, they were all war buddies from the 5th Blackfyre Rebellion, the War of the Five-Penny Kings. Later, they even tried to extend this system of marriage alliances to Tywin Lannister, one that he seriously considered, at least to discuss, that let's offer a marriage alliance between Catelyn's younger sister Lysa Tully and Jaime Lannister. And he thought about it because, well, he wouldn't normally, she's this younger daughter, but after King Aerys spurned his offer that Rhaegar could marry Cersei, that he really wanted Rhaegar to marry Cersei, it didn't work out, he wanted powerful marriage alliances, so like a year or two after that, they were going, hey, can Lysa marry Jaime? And he was at least considering it, he was hearing them out. But then Cersei freaked out that they're going to take Jaime away from me, so she stupidly convinced the Mad King to name Jaime to the Kingsguard, thinking this would mean he could stay with her in the capital. But instead, she didn't think through, no, Tywin will get so insulted that his eldest son and heir would be disinherited by joining the Kingsguard, that he would return to Casterly Rock and take Cersei with him. And all of this makes sense. I don't see this as a plot, though, just pragmatism and power blocks forming. Yes, of course, the great lords who are increasingly wary of the Mad King are going to make alliances to protect their own interests. That doesn't mean they therefore had a goal or coherent strategy after that. I mean, what does this prove? Yeah, there were some power blocks forming, not that they were threatening war. And what the heck does this theory even explain about the involvement of the Maesters, who are apolitical? That the Maesters were turning on the Targaryens? Why? I don't think the Maesters probably didn't help kill off the dragons. Maybe they poisoned the last one or two. We'll have to wait for the later reign of Aegon III and Fire and Blood Part 2 to figure that out, but why would they have a driving need to destroy the Targaryens now when they don't have dragons anymore? To me, this is the equivalent of people blaming crop failures and plagues on Bloodraven. No, just what would the Maesters have to gain? Maybe Rickard's Maester forwarded him a letter by someone else. That the Maesters are just messengers. They're whispering in his ears. Maybe, that's how he exchanged letters with Hoster Tully and Jon Arryn. The Maesters are a non-entity in this to me. While the quotes in the World Book got me suspecting otherwise, the basic information that I'm arguing against from this essay was still actually available when it was written in 2012. All of this was present in Book 5. That Rhaegar didn't immediately act after the tournament. It's not explicitly said. The one small difference is only the World Book said Lord Whent must have had financial backing. Only the World Book spelled it out, but it was sort of implied. But the other point about only Book 5 is when it says Varys is specifically the person who told the Mad King to go to the tournament. All this stuff about young Griff and the Blackfyres, all this Book 5 stuff, that's all in there. So it's not that all this info wasn't available to this essay. They just drew different conclusions than I did, because I cross-referencing different information. First off, this essay doesn't really account for any of those 3 points. Well, who was the secret backer? It assumes it was Rhaegar. Why didn't Rhaegar do anything? It has no real explanation for that. And worst of all, the essay, actually read this part of the essay, it doesn't give a coherent explanation of what the Southron Ambitions actually were, and just sort of flip-flops between one point or another without really saying anything. The broad point it presents is that the Stark-Tully-Arryn Baratheon alliance didn't actively plan to overthrow the Mad King yet, but was laying the groundwork of support behind Rhaegar to eventually lead to a Great Council that would declare Aerys mentally incompetent. But then it'll at times flip-flop and go, it was an anti-Targaryen alliance, they didn't even like Rhaegar. And it can't really choose. It does loosely believe that Varys was a Rhaegar supporter, and it does not treat Varys as a player in this, just as one of several conspirators. So even this essay doesn't think he was an Aerys loyalist. They said there's no way he's stupid enough to do this. He told him to go to the tournament to encourage everyone to turn on him because he's a Rhaegar supporter, and he wants people to see how crazy Aerys is. Quote from the essay, "Since this story is a Song of Ice and Fire, even plans made by Varys and comparable master schemers fail. If this big plan was ever constructed like that, it clearly failed. Rhaegar's abduction of Lyanna, Tywin's resigning the Handship and going to brood in Casterly Rock, and the death of both Rickard and Brandon must have been a serious setback." He considers these setbacks to Varys' plans. Now, keep in mind, I respect Stephen Zass. I just disagree with him in this essay. I'm not trying to tear him apart, just this theory that it doesn't account for Rhaegar's delay, Varys' actions, and yeah, it was rumored Robert was privately infuriated with Rhaegar, but that might have soured his support, but maybe he would forgive him. Maybe he was just trying to flatter her and came off as a bit fresh. This wouldn't even wreck his relationship with the Starks, Tullys, and Arryns. That nothing he did at the tourney would have inherently disrupted an alliance with Robert. Maybe he was trying to gain his favor by flattering his betrothed. They said he was furious in private. But it's not on the level of kidnapping and murder, particularly because everyone was freaked out by how crazy his father was, even after doing that. So, I'm not sure. But the point where he just said in the quote I gave, what about naming Jaime Lannister to the Kingsguard, that was not an unexpected setback to Rhaegar. Naming Jaime to the Kingsguard made Tywin abandon the Mad King. His best advisor abandoned him. That isn't a setback. A Rhaegar supporter would want to do something like that. Or even a Blackfyre supporter, for that matter. He's knocking out the supports from under Aerys. I'm not really sure, but the point is that the essay then draws attention to a question of why did the Mad King demand Robert Baratheon's arrest after he executed Brandon and Rickard in King's Landing? Because Brandon demanded Lyanna back. Robert didn't at first. He was still in the Eyrie. Brandon happened to be in the area, so he rode right there. And because he was at River Run, they were in the Eyrie, so he just rode right there. And the thing he thinks up is that this was Varys trying to turn Robert against the Mad King even more. Possibly, I'm not really sure. But at this point in the war, even after killing Brandon and Rickard, were Rhaegar and Aerys considered on the same side or not? That Rhaegar could have just come out and said, from hiding, and said, my father is insane, he murdered the Starks, everyone unite behind me to overthrow him. Like, who wouldn't have? Because, oh, we hear you abducted Lyanna Stark. He could say, well, she's no one's wife, she was just betrothed and she fell in love with me. Robert would be annoyed, but the Starks wouldn't, if they had to choose between Rhaegar or Aerys. The key point is that for years, Westeros hadn't been divided between a pro-Targaryen and anti-Targaryen camp. World Book makes this very clear. There was a pro-Rhaegar faction at court and a pro-Aerys faction. And it's a myth that the war started with Rhaegar's abduction of Lyanna. I hate it when people use that phrase. It started when the Mad King killed Brandon and Rickard Stark. So maybe he could have set that aside, that some people build up, oh, the Targaryens were getting weak for decades after the dragons died, and people were starting to try to overthrow them. People fought through 5 successive Blackfyre rebellions after the dragons died out to support the Targaryens. He says, oh, these all 5 of these guys must have been war buddies, Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, Rickard Stark, that they were war buddies from the War of the Nine Penny Kings, who got together in common interest to make Southron Ambitions to what? Overthrow the Targaryens? They fought for the Targaryens against the Blackfyres in the War of the Nine Penny Kings. Like, who were they rebelling against? And this is where it gets me, like, in the middle of it, like, after the Battle of the Bells, the essay even says, quote, it's not entirely clear what the war aim at this point was. Perhaps Arryn and other schemers still hoped to overthrow Aerys and restore the Targaryen dynasty, perhaps with more freedoms and privileges for the kingdoms, strengthening their autonomy. All these plans went out the window when Lyanna died and Rhaegar was slain, however. Eddard's fury was second only to Robert's, who would not suffer one Targaryen to survive, and grew into the natural contender for the throne in exchange for the Targaryen dynasty as a whole. Perhaps Jon Arryn still hoped to be able to broker a compromise after the Trident, restoring some peaceful order under Targaryen rule, but it was all blown to hell when Tywin Lannister made his own step and conquered King's Landing, murdering all Targaryens in the city. No one anticipated that move, but it created a fait accompli. There was no turning back, and the Targaryen dynasty had to be removed as a whole. This makes no sense. First, this long quote from the essay that the vaunted Southron Ambitions that we all really took as fact, this is admitting in the titular essay, Southron Ambitions, that there was no coherent Southron ambition, singular. The Southron ambition to do what? The Southron goal to do what? And it says, even after the Battle of the Bells, when they were in active war, they still couldn't tell if they were just fighting the Mad King or the Mad King and Rhaegar to eliminate all Targaryens. That it doesn't really say what their defense pact is trying to do. And according to the World Book, it would fit into the model of, I just weight the World Book so much more that they spelled out, it wasn't pro-Targaryen and anti-Targaryen, it was pro-Rhaegar and anti-Rhaegar if you supported his father because you wanted political favors from an insane king. And the way this is phrased is also very clunky. All went out the window when Lyanna died and Rhaegar was slain. Okay, I'm trying not to nitpick too much, but I think he just means after Rhaegar died, because Lyanna died after the Mad King did. Ned reached her as she was dying, after the fall of King's Landing, after lifting the siege of Storm's End. But I'm going to disregard that as just a random mistake type. It doesn't really alter the point he made about, well, after Rhaegar died, the plan changed. After he died in battle, leading an army in defense of his father's rule. What does that even mean? That, well, we kind of hope to take him alive? It treats Jon Arryn as the political mastermind of all of these events, organizing Southron Ambitions, that he thought he could orchestrate some sort of peace even after Rhaegar died, only for this to be snatched away when Tywin had sacked the capital, and it just doesn't fit. And also that these are men who, like I said, they fought for the Targaryens against the Blackfyres. These are Targaryen loyalists. So trying to gather my thoughts here. I'm sorry I didn't script this better, but the difference is the Southron Ambitions theory considers Jon Arryn and his Southron Ambitions with Rickard Stark to be the schemers orchestrating Robert's rebellion. I suspect that the real man behind the curtain was Varys. Okay, maybe not for Robert's rebellion itself, because Rhaegar abducting Lyanna and the Mad King subsequently executing Brandon and Rickard was something none of them could have predicted. But we've become too used to looking at the events of Robert's Rebellion through that lens, taking as a given that they were pro and anti-factions. So how does all that tie together with the tourney at Harrenhal? That I don't think Southron Ambitions mean anything, and even then it flip-flops between the tourney was Rhaegar trying to recruit Rickard and Jon Arryn and their children, to it was a good way for these lords to plot against Aerys and Rhaegar. It doesn't really have a coherent plan there. But it all comes down to those who think Varys is genuinely a Rhaegar Targaryen supporter and those who truly think that he's really a Blackfyre supporter and young Griff is an imposter. The Southron Ambitions theory hinges on the assumption that the first of these two options is correct. Varys was a Rhaegar supporter, not a Blackfyre supporter. But, I told you about this before, did the Mad King coming to the tourney at Harrenhal actually help Rhaegar's position? Yes, it convinced everyone he was insane. That isn't helping Rhaegar. Then in a flashback to when he departed King's Landing in the novels, Rhaegar told Jaime that he'd hoped to call a great council to have his father deposed without bloodshed. He didn't even want a war to happen at all. Rhaegar wasn't recruiting people for a rebellion. He was trying to slowly gather allies against his father through diplomacy, then have him declared mentally unwell. His master plan was a great council. You don't call a great council if you're planning an open rebellion. That his plan was to gradually accumulate more and more allies, convincing them my father is medically insane, until he could turn on him without a drop of blood being shed. Rhaegar was in no rush. There is no ticking clock for that. If you're slowly building up allies on a scale of years. So it might seem like his father showing up and acting insane in public would strengthen Rhaegar's position. It actually didn't. All it did was push events to happen too fast. Rhaegar had wanted to slowly undermine his father's position and gain more allies over time. Now the battle lines and allegiances were thrown in sharp relief. That all of a sudden everyone at Harrenhal had to either point and go, this man is insane, or you're a lickspittle and a sycophant, laughing at the Mad King's jokes, acting like he's normal, not willing to say the Emperor is naked, because you're hoping to still get his political favors. That when he showed up, the battle lines were drawn. You had to either declare for him or against him. And even the ones who declared for him were just cynically, I can get political favors from this insane king by taking advantage of his rivalry with his own son, who is not insane. And this didn't help Rhaegar at all. Yes, the houses that fought for Aerys in the rebellion knew he was insane. The Tyrells fought for them, and Mace Tyrell was personally at the tourney of Harrenhal. He saw him being insane and still did his political arithmetic and said, I'm going to fight for him anyway. Consider who their supporters even were. The Martells, because he basically held Elia Martell hostage. Why did the Tyrells keep fighting for him, even though Mace had seen with his own eyes, in a world that doesn't have TV and newspapers, he had seen he's a crazy man? I mean, Oberyn was there as well. Oberyn saw with his own eyes and could tell his brother, the king is insane, but admittedly he has Elia hostage. There's little we can do about this. The point is that when the Mad King actually came in person to Harrenhal, did anyone shrug and go, wow, he's crazy. Let's crown Rhaegar right now? His sycophants on the small council didn't. Mace Tyrell didn't. That people didn't already think that weren't swayed to the other side. Rhaegar was trying to bide his time and use diplomacy and a great council, slowly building up allies, slowly getting Mace Tyrell to think of him as an alternative. Instead, Varys brought the conflict to a head too early. He rushed his plan, when Aerys still had enough people willing to fight for him, that maybe Rhaegar won't win. So I ask you, what was Varys' strategy in softening up Westeros before young Griff's invasion with the Golden Company in the 5th novel? Did he wait for Cersei to gradually and quietly pick off the Tyrells? Or, other way, wait for Kevan Lannister to smooth over relations with the Tyrells and put an end to their squabblings? No! He killed Kevan Lannister, framed the Tyrells for it, and all sorts of other things on top of that. He didn't wait for them to strengthen their position. He tricked the Lannisters and Tyrells into actively fighting each other as quickly as possible before they could get their pieces in the right position, leading to a bloodbath, thus weakening both sides. You trick your enemies into fighting each other. Then an external enemy comes in and takes them out. That's how Varys operates. And this is what all the great villains do. I mean, in Star Trek terms, it's what the Romulans do. They trick their enemies into fighting. It's what the Dominion did. That they try to trick their enemies into fighting each other. So, directly compare the Lannisters and Tyrells in Book 5 with the two factions leading up to the tourney, which were not pro-Targaryen and anti-Targaryen, but pro-Rhaegar and pro-Aerys. Those are the political blocks. And what does the Master Manipulator do? Trick the power blocks into fighting each other. Another example, The Expanse. When the conspiracy making the protomolecule in Season 1, they trick everyone into having a war between Earth and Mars to distract everyone from Protogen conducting their experiments. That you find where there's a Cold War, that it's a powder keg and all you need is a spark. You set it off to distract everyone, to get them to fight each other, to take them from the side. Or, I'm also a James Bond fan. If you remember that quote from Spectre, the original ones, where they use the analogy of a fighting fish, that there's these two fish fighting. The third one in the corner backed away from the fight, waiting to see who wins, that whoever wins will be badly mauled, the other one will be dead. Then the third fish will swoop in and kill them all. That's what Spectre is. That they said, as Spectre, we are tricking the Western democracies and the Soviets into fighting each other, and then we're going to pick off the weakened winner. That's what they do. So summing all this up, the Southron Ambitions theory came out after the 5th novel, and it's taken from a statement in the 5th novel pointing out all the marriage alliances between the great houses. But it doesn't take into account all the other sources that repeatedly stated that the two main power blocks were Rhaegar-Aerys. And the weirdest thing is, this is the 5th novel, like I said, all this Blackfyre stuff came to the forefront then. And it's what TV Tropes calls the unspoken plan guarantee. That if they prominently say, wow, which of the Lannisters was trying to kill Jon Arryn, it's really Littlefinger who killed Jon Arryn to trick the Lannisters and Starks into fighting each other. The unspoken plan guarantee that if they spend so much time building up Southron Ambitions with this really prominent speech by Barbary Dustin, I don't think that was the central point, because it's too prominent. It'd be like the surprise reveal will come later that no, it was really Littlefinger, it was really something else. So when you have them very prominently say in the 5th book, this is who young Griff is, he's really Rhaegar's surviving son with Elia, subtle hints, like the Stark-Lannister war with Jon Arryn, that there were little hints even in Book 2 that, like when Tyrion shows up to Cersei, he's like, well, did you poison him? She's like, I thought you did. Well, that is exactly what they said, but it's like they never figured out, well, who killed him? That from their perspective, they were just as confused as anyone. That it's a hint it wasn't them. that because they so prominently said, oh, he's Rhaegar's son, but at the same time, if you pay attention to the fifth book, all these hints about the Blackfyres. Things like, a lot of it's in the Tyrion storyline. When Illyrio has the weirdest line to Tyrion, he says, ah yes, Malus the Monstrous from the 5th Blackfyre Rebellion. Everyone says the Blackfyre line died with him, but when Illyrio describes it, he says, ah yes, the Blackfyres died out in the male line with him. Like, why would you make such a suspiciously specific denial? Like, he's implying the Blackfyres survived in the female line to have a grandson or something. And then later on, when Tyrion is with the Golden Company, he goes, why are you supporting the alleged son of Rhaegar, Targaryen, when historically for the past 100 years the Golden Company have been Blackfyre supporters fighting the Targaryens? There's just enough hints of this, of something is going on, that I think it's the unspoken plan guarantee that if they're prominently saying he's Rhaegar's son, he probably isn't, because they're also hinting that it's setting up a surprise reveal. But all this was in the 5th book, and Southron Ambitions really makes no attempt to deal with these prominent fan theories about the return of the Blackfyres. Instead, it just treats Varys as a bit player. He was a Rhaegar supporter, not much else going on there. Well, I've been discussing this up to now. I know I'm rambling, I'm sorry, I dashed it off. It would take me a week to do this. It took me one night rambling this way for an hour with a podcast. Up to now, I've been discussing things from the ground up. I started with the evidence about the tournament at Harrenhal, gradually building up to I think it was really Varys. Let's come at it from the other direction. If I was building from the ground up with evidence, let's try top down. 2 alternate scenarios, then going, well, does that actually match what happened? If Varys was secretly a Rhaegar supporter or a Blackfyre supporter, these 2 scenarios, what would he theoretically do? What would he theoretically do if he didn't know what ultimately happened in Robert's Rebellion? And how does this match what he actually did? Well, if Varys was secretly a Blackfyre supporter this entire time, the events described in the books are exactly what he would have done. Organized a big tournament, pressured Rhaegar into going to recruit men against his father, only to then warn Aerys about it, setting him even further against Rhaegar, exacerbating the rivalry between them. And on top of all that, using an elaborate ploy to goad the Mad King into showing himself at a big public event so everyone could see how crazy he was, actually undermined Rhaegar's long-term plan to just quietly gather lords for a great council. A slow and steady alliances plan that would have taken years. Instead, he rushed everything, ruined Rhaegar's plans for diplomacy, and forced what was increasingly going to be an armed rebellion with swords and thousands of deaths. He was pushing a civil war by rushing Rhaegar's plans. This is exactly what Varys would have done if he was a Blackfyre. This is what he did to the Lannisters and the Tyrells later on in the 5th book. But then Rhaegar stole Lyanna. But thinking on his feet, it was Varys who had Aerys' ear when he had Rickard and Brandon Stark burned alive. The Southron Ambitions theory just says, oh, well, he couldn't stop Aerys because he was insane. Varys is a master manipulator, and he got him to kill the lords of a great house. But, like, Ellard Glover, he didn't kill, and they never explained why he didn't kill that other guy, but he died in the war later on at the Tower of Joy, but Varys could have very easily manipulated him. He was in a position to manipulate him into killing Rickard. How do we know it wasn't his idea? It was Varys who, even the essay acknowledges, pushed for him to also demand the arrest of Robert Baratheon, who up to that point hadn't actually done anything to harm the king, and wasn't directly involved yet. And Rhaegar had upset his plans, but thinking on his feet, Varys wasn't trying to win the war for Aerys or Rhaegar. he was trying to manipulate an evenly matched war, that he was trying to quickly turn enough lords against Aerys to turn it into a bloodbath before Rhaegar could quietly remove him. That no, we need to instantly have Robert on the warpath, to have Ned seeking revenge and justice for his father's death. That they wouldn't have listened to Rhaegar after that. Had he come back and my father, and he might have, my father's crazy, but he's thinking on his feet, trying to screw up the Targaryens and set them against each other and destroy attempts at peace. And what's the other scenario? I think it's a given that if he was a Blackfyre, this is what he would have done. The other scenario that I dismiss out of hand, even this essay does, that he was an Aerys supporter, because he's not that stupid to think it was a good idea to go to the tournament. The other option is he's a Rhaegar supporter. Theoretically, what would he have done if he was a Rhaegar supporter? Encourage a big tournament to recruit lords to Rhaegar's side? Yes. Tell the Mad King to go in person. Why? To show them how great you are? Rhaegar wasn't in a rush. A Rhaegar supporter would not have wanted to do that. The entire point of a tournament is to quietly recruit people outside of Aerys' gaze. So it doesn't add up. So on top of that, all the other stuff, and then ordering the arrest of Robert Baratheon. How does that help Rhaegar? So from an in-universe perspective, I'm convinced Varys orchestrated the tourney at Harrenhal. He was the secret benefactor who gave Lord Whent the money for this. He is the one who even encouraged Rhaegar to go and use it as a recruitment tool, and then he sent the Mad King there just to stir up the Sand Kings, to stir them up to fight each other, because he's a secret Blackfyre supporter. That a Rhaegar supporter would not have done these things. In-universe, from an in-universe perspective, the Watsonian perspective, as they say, I'm convinced of that. But then we have the Doyleist perspective, the out-of-universe perspective. This is the only reason I still think of this as a theory and not a fact, that it was Varys the whole time. Out of universe, we have to deal with the chronological order in which George R. R. Martin introduced all of these plot elements. Fundamentally, the Blackfyres were only introduced between the second and third novels. I mean, the name Blackfyre doesn't even appear in genealogy lists. They never mention the sword. It only appears in the third novel. It does not appear in the first two books at all. The Blackfyres are actually first introduced in the second Tales of Dunk and Egg prequel novella, The Sworn Sword, which was published between the second and third books. First two books wasn't in it at all. Everything about the first Blackfyre rebellion, even major characters like Bloodraven, did not exist in the first two books. So, when Martin came up with the backstory in the first novel about what secretly happened behind the scenes at the Tourney of Harrenhal, who did he think organized it when he wrote the first novel? Did he even think it had a secret organizer? Did he just think it was a convenient big tournament, and he only layered this on by the third novel of people were thinking Rhaegar was recruiting men against the Mad King? That wasn't really spelled out in the first book. That came later. Does this shoot down the whole theory about Varys being a secret Blackfyre and the Blackfyres weren't there until the third book? Well, that's a whole separate theory, separate from Tourney at Harrenhal, one which people who are in favor of the Varys is a Blackfyre thing have to contend with, that the Blackfyres weren't in the first book. But it doesn't necessarily shoot it down, because Martin may have come up with new details over the course of writing a long fantasy series across 15 years and 5 books. He's always said he's a gardener, not an architect. But when he gives the whole analogy of the gardener and the architect, he's not saying he made up things randomly to subvert expectations like Benioff did. Just, the core story, he always said, like, the core storyline has been constant. I let subplots grow. That's what he means by that. Like, he knew since before the first book was published what the Red Wedding was going to be, that the first third of this story will conclude, Act 1 ends with the Stark armies being wiped out at the Red Wedding. Like, he knew that before the first book was published. He says he knows how some of the major characters are going to die in later books. But then he'll point out subplots that grew over time, and I'm not shocked by this. It's a big novel series. Subplots grow. As Tolkien said, the story grew in the telling. And the key point of evidence I point to about it in general is, Bloodraven? That it's all but stated in the 5th book that the three-eyed crow that Bran meets, the last Greenseer, is Bloodraven, this Targaryen bastard who later joined the Night's Watch and disappeared beyond the Wall 100 years ago. Elio and Linda from Westeros.org, who co-wrote the World Book with Martin, they said this in one of their videos, that they asked him at one point after the 5th book came out, George, at what point did you know that Bloodraven was the last Greenseer? That he was the three-eyed crow? Because the three-eyed crow, the figure appearing as a three-eyed crow to Bran in his dreams, calling him to come beyond the Wall, to come to the Children of the Forest, that's been there since the first book. That the three-eyed crow has been in there since the first book, and they point out, well, Bloodraven didn't even exist as a character until after the second novel was written. When did you realize this was Bloodraven? When did you spell out who the last Greenseer was? And Martin said, well, it started forming in my mind that he was connected to the Targaryens in some way, that he was related to the Targaryens, around the time I was writing the second novel. Keeping in mind that I don't consider that changing on a dime. That's 2 books into a massive planned 7-book series. He was getting ideas that only reached fruition 3 books later in the 5th novel. I don't consider that randomly rewriting stuff, just gradually expanding evolution. I don't consider this him changing his mind, just filling in the details. We've already seen, in Book 1, Tourney of Harrenhal was just a tourney. He didn't even introduce the idea that, well, maybe it was a secret plan to recruit people until, like, the 5th book. Later on, and just stray mentions through the 3rd book, and the World Book spelling out there was a secret benefactor that blatantly the Lord of Harrenhal could not afford to do such a tournament on his own. That there was accretion, that it accumulates over time, more layers to the story. And that doesn't really contradict anything. The core parts, that Rhaegar ran off with Lyanna motivated by a prophecy, even if he only came up with the idea that Varys had turned his father against him by sending him, nothing has changed by that. It's another layer to it. So I don't think that's contradictory, that he came up with the Blackfyres as this added element. That's what I think anyway. What do you guys think in the comments? Is Varys a Blackfyre, or is he a Rhaegar supporter? And how would that affect his actions at Harrenhal?